Oops, didn't mean to open new terminal windows. All right, so welcome to, cancel that. Welcome to part 2 of video number 2 for building a Sinatra application. I'm your host, Howard, and I have a specific list of things that I want to get done today. So I'm going to open up learn.co study groups and look through what I wrote down. Basically what I want to do today is I want to allow users to be able to log in and out. So, and we'll talk about what it takes for that to happen. That's my main goal. If I get that done, then I might think about adding an index and a show route and views for our journals, okay, our journal entries. Just an overview for those of you who are new or if you haven't caught up yet. What I've built is a journal app, or what we're building, I should say. I have 2 models, journal entry and user. And if I look at those models, journal entry belongs to a user has many journal entries. Notice I'm also using the macro has secure password, which will allow me to use bcrypt to hash and salt my passwords and save them in the database under a column called password digest. What method will this give me access to that we're going to use today? Anybody? There's a particular method when I log in I'm going to use. It's an active record method that requires that we have bcrypt installed. Does anybody know what it is?
The authenticate method.
Exactly. Nice. Yes, Matt, exactly. The authenticate method. That's right. Okay. So let's move on. So what I want to do today, let's see what I wrote down. Part 2 of 4-ish. I'm not sure if I'm going to get this done in 4 episodes. I hope so, though. All right, so for this episode, we're going to add login, sign up, and sign up functionalities, add a journal controller with show and index action and views. Okay, so I think that's doable within this hour. I haven't launched my app yet. I don't really have any controllers or views to speak of, so it doesn't really make sense to launch it just yet. Instead, I'm going to focus on the file structure. And I want to add login and logout capabilities. So let's talk about where I'm going to make that happen. I only have one controller right now, which is application controller. Does anybody have any suggestions or thoughts about where and how I'm going to put these login and logout routes? Let's start with login. Where should I put a login route? Where does it belong? There's no wrong answers here, by the way.
I would say create a user controller.
Okay.
Put that information in there.
Okay, users controller. That's one suggestion. That's a good suggestion. I'm sorry I didn't catch who said that, but that's good. Any other suggestions? A users controller. What else? I could also build a controller that's just responsible for logging in and out. Maybe call it a sessions controller. Controllers don't necessarily have to involve database objects. What I mean by that is I have a table for users and a table for journal entries. Obviously, I'm not going to have a database table for sessions, but I could still build a sessions controller. That would be legitimate. I could also put the logging in and out right at the sort of top level inside of my application controller. I think all 3 of those are valid, and it's sort of up to you as a developer to decide which way you want to go with that. Users controller is a good suggestion because logging in and out has to do with users. That makes sense to me. Okay, I like that thought process. So that's actually what I'm going to do. And so I'm going to create a users controller, which means I add a new file here called users controller. When I name the Ruby file, I'm going to use plural snake case users controller, and it's a Ruby file, so it gets the .rb extension. And this is going to be a class called users controller. Now I'm using uppercase camel case, which is the Ruby convention for naming a class. Plural is what Sinatra expects here. What does this class need to inherit from? Anybody? What do all of my controllers after application controller need to inherit from?
From application controller.
Exactly. And what does that allow for me? Why do I do that? right? Application controller inherits from Sinatra base. Why don't I have all these inheriting from Sinatra base? What does this give me?
Access to everything in the application controller.
Exactly. So any methods that I build inside of application controller will therefore be available across all of my other controllers. The configuration will stand, and any helper methods I build down here, which I'm going to build a few, will now be available throughout all of my other controllers. Okay. All right. So let's think now about what routes and what views do I need to allow someone to log in. Anyone?
You need get.
Okay. What should this look like?
Login.
Okay, I could do login. Should I nest this under users if I'm going to be in the users controller? Or should I just, or do we like just login?
I've seen it both ways.
Right, and that's kind of the question. And this is a matter of convention, and it's a matter of personal preference. It's sort of, I guess it's a little bit of either one. Do you want to put this in the users controller? If so, then in the views, anything in the users controller should probably be nested under a users folder. So should this be users login, or do we like having this just top level get login and leaving it that way? We can take a vote. Does anyone have any preferences or thoughts, one way or the other?
I kind of like it top level.
Okay, so then in that case, get login will match the route, and then where that will come into play will be when we render, right? So we'll put that. We'll think about that. So then where should I build a view? I guess is the next question. If you say top level, I'm going to create a new file. What should it be called?
Login.erb.
That's it. It's an ERB file called login, and I'm just going to label it. This is my login page. Top level. That way, if I see this load, I'll know that that's what I hit. Okay. This will go away eventually, but I'm going to leave it there for now. So that was for login. And what about sign up? This is going to look pretty similar, right?
Yeah, get sign up.
Okay. So I need, this is going to, what's the job of this particular route here? Get login. The purpose of this route is to do what?
To authenticate the user and add their session.
Close, but not quite. So hold that thought. That's going to be the answer to a question coming very soon. What's
To show them the login page.
Yes, is to show them the login page. Is to render, I'll say, login page, which means the login form. Okay? So then get login will be what? What goes inside of here?
ERB.
ERB.
Okay, ERB, yes, yep, everyone's correct. And then to what?
Login.
Oops, can I do this? Will that work?
Yes.
I think so. And we can try that, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a new terminal window, and I'm going to run my shotgun from there. And I'll go to localhost 9393/login, and we'll see what happens. If I see my little, it looks like we have an error, great. So, oh, maybe those are just warnings. Those are all warnings. I see there's my request, get login. Let's see what happens. Sinatra doesn't know this ditty. In application controller, try this, etc., etc. Okay, this is a great error. What does it mean if I get Sinatra doesn't know this ditty?
You don't have a route set up.
It means it doesn't recognize the route. That's exactly right. And so it gives us a little suggestion. If I just copy and paste this into my application controller, it would probably work. Does anybody know the problem right now, though? What did I not do when I created my user's controller. I skipped a step, kind of on purpose because I want to see this error, okay?
Didn't mount it in your config file.
That's exactly right. I didn't mount it in my config.ru file. So, and I even made myself a note, here is where I'm going to mount other controllers with use, okay? So I use the use method and I pass in user's controller, and that tells Sinatra, hey, we have another controller here that we're now going to use as well. Application controller is the main controller we're going to run. All our other controllers are going to inherit from that and will be therefore available. Now that I've done that, if I refresh the page, I may have to restart the server. I don't remember. We'll see. Or Shotgun might be nice enough to allow it to work. And it does. And so now we see login.erb, which is what I put inside of this ERB file, and that means that's working, okay? I should probably at this point commit. So I'm gonna run a git status and a git diff to kind of see what I've done. So let's see, I've built a user's controller, I've added a login.erb page, and I've modified my config.ru. I'm gonna break that up into 3 different commits. So let's say git add app controllers users controller. I think that's the order I did it. Commit that, add users controller with 2 routes, sort of skeletoned, I guess, or scaffolded. Then I'm going to grab my login. What was that?
Howard,
Yeah.
what happens when you just do, because I've been working on my Sinatra project and I just do git add period,
Yep.
and then I just do my git commit. What's the difference with doing the git add period and adding the text like you did at the end?
That's such a good question. Can anyone answer Joss's question? That's a great question, by the way. I love that question. Can anyone else answer it? What am I doing? Why am I doing what I'm doing right now?
Something about, I think the period adds everything.
That's right. The period adds everything that I've, so if I did git add dot, this file would be added, these 2 files would be added to be tracked, would be staged, and the changes I have made to config.ru, which already exists, would also be staged all together as one, and then when I commit, that would be 1 commit. I'm simply breaking it into 3 different commits. And so what I'm doing is I'm highlighting that we should have granular commits, small commits, very specific each one. That's the preferred pattern. If you're using git add dot, which by the way is what I use most of the time, that's fine. The idea is that if we don't want too big of commits, so we want our commits to be small, specific, less than 50 characters, and so that's why I'm breaking it up. I'm simply breaking it up into multiple commits, and I can do that instead of saying git add dot, I can git add particular files, and when I do that, then I can commit those individually rather than all together. That's all.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. I'm glad you asked it. Git commit add login.erb view. And then finally git commit. Now I'm going to actually git add dot because the only thing I have left is that I mounted the controller, and I know that that's what's in this commit. Mount users controller in config.ru. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and push these up. Awesome. So what routes do I need for login? I really never finished answering that question. We've got the one that's going to render the login view. What do I need next? Whenever I load a view that has a form, it's always going to have another route that's sort of hand in hand with it. So what does that look like? Was that Maurice?
Yeah.
I heard you say post, right?
Right.
And what should we be posting to?
Yeah, you know what? This always confuses me.
Login?
Post, and this one, and I think I wonder if I understand your confusion already. Post login, yeah, what are we creating here? Posting is usually creating something new. Here it's a little bit abstract and vague what's being created. Can anyone describe what we're creating here? And it's not something in the database.
I mean, does this relate to like the form action?
Yep, it does. Yep. Our form action is going to be, the action is going to be login, the method is going to be post. Okay.
Okay, so the action has to match what I have here.
Yes.
Login.
Action is going to be, action is the URL. The method is, in this case, the method corresponds to the, see, this language is confusing here. The method on the form corresponds, in this case, to the method that we're actually invoking. This is a Sinatra method post, right? So it corresponds to the Sinatra method, and Sinatra purposely named these methods after the HTTP verbs. The HTTP verb is also known as a method in the form, right? Or as an HTML attribute of the form. What kind of HTTP request are we sending? A post request, we expect to be creating something. In this case, it's not something in the database, but rather something slightly more abstract, but still something. And it's a session. We're creating a session. Okay? Which really just means we're adding a key value pair to the session hash. All right? Anybody have questions on that?
I did, but you just clarified it.
Okay. So we're kind of going, we're moving along here. So let's start here. Because I do have, remember, I created 3 users in my database. So I don't know if I'm going out of order creating login before sign up, but I know I have some seed data, so I think I'm pretty comfortable doing it this way. So first I have an ERB to login, and then I have a post login. And what the job of this route is to receive I before E except after C. Yeah, okay. Receive the login form, comma, find the user and log the user in. Okay? So we're going to say create a session. All right? And let's just put a binding here for now. Make sure that we can eventually hit this. So now I think the next step would be to look at what are we going to build inside of this login page. Okay? So what needs to go here?
A form.
Okay. Not a farmer, but actually a form. That's right. And I don't really need a class right now. I definitely need an action. Where are we going?
Login.
Yep. Yep. And we already talked about the method is actually going to stay post. That's what we want. And what do we need inside this form? What do we need inputs for?
So 2 things. One would be to put your username and password.
Okay. And is that what we have if I look back at my schema just to make sure? In my schema, I created users with a name, an email, and a password digest. I think we decided email is going to be what we log in and out with. Okay. Mm-hmm. Username or email are equally valid. We chose email during our last session. Okay. So this is going to be a text input with a name of email. And what's this next one need to be? A name of what? Anybody know?
Password.
Password. How come don't I have a column of password digest? Why can this just be password, not password digest? If I look at my schema, I've got password digest here, not password. Anybody know? The answer is really just that the people who wrote bcrypt are kind, and they allow us to simply refer to it as a password once we've built the database column, and it sort of knows what to do from there. We can kind of leave it at that. Okay, so I've got an input type text, which is email, and input type password. Sorry, type text whose name is password, and finally, what's the other input that's really important here to make anything happen? What type? Exactly, submit. And I'll call this login. Actually, it doesn't really need a name. And I'll give it a value of submit. Or how about login? All right. And so I do want to label these forms. So let's label for email, we'll say email. And label again for password, we'll say password. Okay, and let's see what this renders now for us. If I go back to login, which I'm still there, let's refresh the page. I can watch in my window. I should see the get login fire again. It's going to go through all of my controller actions, start with the application controller. It's going to look around in this file, nothing matches get login. So then it's going to move on to users controller now that it's mounted. And the first route matches get login. Okay. And so then what happens inside, we render our login page, which just means that we're going to reach into our views, find login, and slap it in inside of our layout file and load it onto in the browser. And we get login with email and password. This looks pretty good. Is everybody feeling okay about this? Any questions so far? Any questions? I have a question. We named these these inputs email and password. And what I mean by that is we chose the HTML attribute for these two inputs, name, the name attribute, and we named them email and password. Is this arbitrary or is this really important?
I would say it's important.
Why? That's right, Joss. Why?
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to explain it okay.
That's
but,
okay. Give it a shot.
It has something to do with how the params are entered and stored into the database.
100%. And before we get to database, it has to do with exactly what you said, the way params are stored. So what is params?
The information that's put in by the user.
Okay, yes. And what I'll say is params is the vehicle or the container that's holding the information that's being passed in by the user. Are you okay with me tweaking what you said a little bit?
Yeah.
What data structure is params?
A hash.
It's a hash. So I think of params like a bus. That bus is just a round trip. It just goes back and forth from the views to the controller, to the views to the controller, to the views to the controller, and it picks up passengers. And those passengers are the keys come from the name attributes of the inputs when it comes to forms. So in this case, it's going to have a key of email with whatever the user passes in as the value. Likewise, password with whatever the user passes in as the value. And that bus is going to go from the form and carry that to the controller. Okay. What other piece of data or what other way does params, or I should say, what's at least one other way that params gets its key value pairs besides inputs on a form? Does anyone know? While we're talking about it. Any guesses? Params also gets key value pairs from the dynamic bits of a URL. So if I'm on like a show page, maybe I have users / ID / whatever, that if ID is dynamic, in other words, if we write it as a symbol in the URL, that will become the key whose value is whatever we enter in, and that also is contained in the params hash. Okay, so the params hash is a bus carrying information back and forth from the controller to the views, to the controller to the views, etc., etc., etc. Questions about that? Okay, so let's talk about a couple debugging techniques here. I'm going to go ahead and sign in. Let's see, I'm going to be Franny, and Franny's password is going to be fish. Why not? And Franny's going to click login, and that's going to send a new request, hopefully. And we should see it within our log here. If I expand this, it might be easier to read, maybe. Okay, it's thinking about it. It's thinking really, really hard. And okay, so we actually don't get to see the request yet because I put it in a binding. But we can tell it went where it should, right? It must have been a post login request because we caught on this binding. All right, and if we look back at our controller, our user's controller, I have post login with a binding.pry. This is where we are. So this route clearly did match. What information do I want to look at right now? What would be interesting to me? Or what's interesting to you? What do you want to see?
Params.
params. And params is a great thing to, this is what I want to see. And sure enough, I have a key value pair of email, Franny, password, fish. Okay, that's what I entered in here. Notice that if I went back to my login.erb, I'm going to exit this quickly. If I went back and I changed the name to person's email for whatever reason, and this is their password, right? Those are terrible names for stuff. If I go back and I reload the login page, and maybe, and I type in whatever, or whoever has a password of my password, and I log in, I should catch again, hopefully, in that same place. And we'll notice the differences in the params hash. And now we see that the keys have changed because I changed the names of the inputs. Now I have person's email, right, which corresponds to person's email as the HTML attribute name. Okay, and similarly, this is their password is now the key. This is their password, right? Everybody okay with that? Everybody see the difference there? And what we want to be able to do is refer to the keys and match them with attributes. So here, email is going to be the attribute, is going to be one of the attributes, and the other one's going to be password. Okay, so I want these names to match the names of the attributes, and we'll see what that allows us to do here in just a moment. I'm going to exit out of this binding. And now let's talk, any questions about that? Okay, let's talk about what we want to do inside of here. Let's make a list. I know I actually kind of already wrote it. Find the user. I'm going to say authenticate the user. Log the user, and there's a lot going on here. And then redirect to the user. I'm going to say the user's landing page. Could be show, could be index, could be like a dashboard, whatever I want it to be, okay? So I think that this makes sense. These are the 4 steps I want to take, generally anyway. So how am I going to find the user? Let's start there. Any thoughts? What information do I have available to me?
I would do @user.
Okay. Oops.
This is to find the user, right?
That's right.
@user equals user.find params ID.
Do I have a params ID? Remember, params looks like this right now.
So params email.
Exactly. Except, can I do that? Can I use the find method and email?
Find by.
There we go. Find by, and then what do when we use find by takes a key value pair. And this can be a really big problem for people if they don't use the key value pair. If I just say like params email, params email, this is a weird bug because I'm expecting a key value pair with the find by method, and I'm only passing a single value. This will actually always return the first user in the database, and it's a silly error. It's tough. When you read about why Active Record does this, it's annoying, whatever. Don't forget your key. So here I want the key of email. Okay. So now I'm going to try and find my user. User equals user.findby email params email. Does everyone understand this line of code? Any questions about it? Everybody good? And so now, we mentioned this before, we're going to authenticate. So how do I authenticate? What does that look like? What does authentication mean? What is authentication? Anybody want to give me a definition?
Maybe verify that the user is actually in, like registered or in the database.
Exactly. Verify the user. And what I like to say is who they say they are. Okay, and exactly what you said. Make sure that they're in the database. They have the right credentials. Email, and in this case, it's email and password combination. Okay. And so how do we do that? Because I used has secure password, what method? Somebody already told me what method we're going to use. I forget who.
You call the authenticate method
Yeah, and what do we call the authenticate method on?
on the user.
Exactly. Okay, what does the authenticate method take as an argument?
Password
The password. And where is the password living right now?
in params.
Params, password, exactly. Okay. Now, this should start sort of like ring a bell, or something should stick out. What's wrong here? Right now I just have this line of code on line 18, like user.authenticate. Okay. What's authenticate going to return to me?
It's going to be either probably true or false.
Yeah, well, let's find out exactly what it is. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop into tux. Actually, I need bundle exec to do that. Let's find out exactly what authenticate does. And first I'm going to check my seed file, because that's where I'm going to be able to see the passwords that I created. I created a couple of users. The first one has an email of howard@howard.com and a password of password. The second one was sherry@sherry.com with a password, again, of password. Okay, good. So what I want to say is like Howard, or let's do Sherry. Sherry equals user.find email Sherry. Sorry, I almost made the same mistake. But first of all, let's check this out. If I just do Sherry, this is good. I'm going to show this off here. I'm going to say sherry@sherry.com. Notice that I actually get back. Oh, well, let's see. Nothing. What happened there? Good. User.find by Sherry at sherry.com. Okay, so this is apparently with a string here, it actually errored out, which is great. That's better actually than what I was thinking. If I do pass in an integer, notice that I get Howard back, right? Like this doesn't even make sense. Find by number 21, and I get the first entry. That's the error I was talking about earlier. Anyway, so let's do it correctly. User.find by passing an email as sherry@sherry.com. There's Sherry, and so I'm going to assign that to a variable. I'm going to use Ruby allows me to use the underscore to refer to the previous return value. So now I have Sherry, and I'm going to say sherry.authenticate. I'm going to pass in goldfish. Goldfish. Okay. Now let's find out what we get back for a bad authentication. False. Good. And how about if I pass in the correct password of password? I actually get back a return value of the user itself. Okay? So it's good to know the return values of these methods. Authenticate returns false when the authentication fails, and true when the authentication, sorry, not true, but the user itself when the authentication works. Notice that I can't just say like, I can't just say, where were we here? Sorry, here we are. I can't just say, like, oh, if this returns a user, why don't we just use authenticate off the bat? Well, the reason is that I need to call authenticate on a user that I already have, okay, on an instance of user, all right? So what am I thinking here? What do I need to do now? If I just call this, so what? It returns false or it returns a user. Does that do me any good? In other words, what does this chunk of code right here need to do? Where does it need to be? It needs to control the action somehow. What do I mean by that?
It should be in an if statement, probably.
That's exactly what I mean. So I basically need to say, if this user is authenticated, I'm going to do one thing, else I'm going to do something else. And what I can do is say, okay, these are the things I want to do if it works. Else, what I want to do is a couple things. Tell the user they entered incorrect credentials, or invalid, I should say. Invalid credentials, and then redirect them to the login page. Okay. Does everyone understand what I just set up here as far as my if-else end? And why I structured it this way? Questions? So if the user is authentic, this will return the actual user object, which is a truthy value. Otherwise, it will return false, and I'll go into this else. So let's talk about success first. What do I want to do now?
Create their session.
Yes. And then, and actually, oh yeah, that's so this is the same thing as what I have up here, log the user in, which really means create their session. And I have to pause for a moment and think about, scratch my head, what do I need in order to create a session? Are there any steps I have to take in order to make that work? Is it just automatic? Do I have this thing called session?
You need to enable sessions first
Yeah, so and where does that go? Do you know?
in the application controller.
Exactly. So inside of application controller, I have this configure do block. Right now it sets a public folder called public, and that relates to, like, for example, if I were going to include images and put them in a public folder, I'm telling Sinatra this is where those things are going to live. And I'm also telling it which one is my views folder. It's very common. It's going to be under app, under views. And so this is where Sinatra is going to look when I render files. It's going to start here, app, views, and then go from there. That's why I can just say login, because it's app, views, login for the one that I've loaded so far. Okay. And I heard somebody say it, enable sessions. Oops, enable sessions. I believe that's the correct syntax. Okay. I simply use the enable. And I need to do one other thing. Does anyone know what it is?
Set your session secret.
Yes. And what I think, let's see if I can do this correctly. Session secret. I believe it's like that. We can look up the syntax if we get it wrong. And I'll say our awesome, thank you, journal app. Does anyone know what this does? We're not going to get deep into it, but we'll mention it. So what this does is it sets a session secret, and so a session ID will therefore be created for this particular session. And what that does is it's an extra layer of security, so that if someone doesn't have the correct session secret and tries to imitate you, they won't be able to. Basically, is the bottom line. Okay. That's the super high level short version, and we're not going to get much deeper. I encourage you though to look it up if you want some more sort of context about what's happening here. But the bottom line is we'll now have access to a hash called session that we can manipulate, which will sort of be the way that we log users in and out. And this is kind of a big deal. So now what I'm going to do, I think I still have my binding in my users controller. No, I don't. Okay, great. So, oh wow, I've got a lot going on here. So if user.authenticate, log the user in, create the user session, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So what does that look like? Here, this is where we are. Just actually, you know what? I feel like demonstration would be helpful here. What I'm going to do is drop a binding right here. And I'm going to go back and comment these 2 lines of code out and save it. I just hope the browser keeps up with me here. I'm going to go ahead and make sure I'm not in any prize currently. Nope, I exited. Great. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page and try to log in. Doesn't matter what I put in this case. Come on. So I'll just put in like A and B, doesn't matter, and log in. I just want to catch in that pry. And right now, when I catch in the pry, okay, what did I do? I put that below my, oh, okay. So I guess it does matter, of course. I forgot that I was past that already. I ran it. I got, by the way, undefined method authenticate for nil class. What does that error tell me, by the way? Let's see if I can grab it quickly. Undefined method authenticate for nil class. That was thrown here on line 18. Can anyone explain what that error means? Anybody?
Did you try to authenticate a user that doesn't exist?
Yes. Very specifically, I got the error message said, it said this, here, I'll write it down. Undefined method authenticate for nil class. What does this is an error. If you haven't seen this error, you haven't been coding in Ruby. What is this error specifically telling me?
Is you're trying to call authenticate on nil.
Yes. And specifically that means that @user has a value of nil. It doesn't mean that I don't have a method called authenticate for my user class or for my user instances. Rather, it means that the value of user at this moment in time is nil. Why? Because I tried to just enter A and B for my email and password, which doesn't exist in the database. So this thing, user.findBy then returned nil. That was assigned to @user. So @user was nil, and nil, it's nil as an object, as an instance of the nil class in Ruby, does not have an authenticate method. So don't. A lot of people, a lot of students say, "Oh, mate, I must not have an authenticate method for my users." You do, but not for nil. Okay, so be careful with that error message. Okay, so now I'm actually going to enter valid data. Sorry, email was howard@howard.com. Password is my password. Now, hopefully, I'll catch on that binding. If I entered my credentials correctly. Good. Okay. And what I want to show is if I type in session right now, I get an empty hash. Okay. Like there's no session ID. There's nothing in here whatsoever. Okay. Session. And like that's not what I want. So if I go back to let's save this. Let's save my application. Let's undo and save and get out of my binding. Go back to login and try again. Maybe. What I want to show is that my session hash will actually have changed a little bit. And password. Now that I've enabled sessions and I have a session secret, when I catch in my binding now and I look at session, notice that it has a session ID. It also has a CSRF token, a tracking, blah, 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 some other information here. So now this session is now going to be available for use, right? It's sort of primed and ready to go. The session ID is, by the way, a hashed version of that session secret combined with whatever else happens sort of behind the scenes. We're not going to dive deep into it, but this is part of the security of why sessions, when you log in on your browser, you're the only one who gets this ID. And so it can't be replicated just because somebody else has some of your credentials somewhere else. All right. So now what do I want to do? What actually logs a user in? Not binding.pry, of course.
Howard, I have a question about session ID.
Yeah, of course.
So every time a user logs in, do they get a unique session ID or does the session ID stay the same?
Good question. Hey, let's find out. So questions like that, just like that, what we want to do is find out, right? So what I'm going to do is log in again. And first of all, I haven't assigned a user ID to the session hash yet, right? So let's just see what happens if I log in as someone else, which I'm not really logging in though, right? Because all I'm doing is passing information back and forth in the hash. So I haven't truly logged in at all. So if I log in again, let's find out what we see here. We'll have to make this a little bit bigger because there's no way anyone's going to memorize this giant thing, the session ID. And oops, will we be able to see it? I can copy and paste it. Oh, can we see it there? Okay, can everyone see the top and the bottom of the screen here? Of course.
Yes.
Hang on, not anymore, right? Okay, so let's kind of look carefully. It looks like it starts with 94AC F4 B80 blah 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 blah. And I guess the only way to really test it out would be to copy it. So if I copy this value, and then I say, hey, are you equal to this value? And the answer is going to be true. Okay, so this browser is using that session secret and which creates a hashed version for this session ID. All right. Does that answer your question?
So the session ID stays the same for the user.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, for the browser. And then what we'll see is that here, and this is kind of where we're going. Now, once I'm actually going to log someone in, we'll look at what that looks like. So let's exit the binding. And now what is that actually looking like logging a user in? I have a user instance variable now. And what does it mean to log that user in? What action do I take to actually log a user in? Anybody? I'm going to add a key value pair to the session hash. Can anyone help me do that? Session is my hash. I'm going to choose a key of user ID. Notice that it needs to be a key we don't already have down here, session ID, CSRF, tracking. Okay, and that's pretty easy. Some people will use ID, and that's okay. I prefer user ID, it's more specific. What am I assigning as the session? I'm using the user ID. That's what I'm assigning here. And I'm going to assign it to at user.id. Okay, this is a unique value coming from the database. Each user only has a unique ID. And so I'm going to assign that as the session user ID.
So the user ID in the session hash is something you just created.
Yes, I just created this. I mean, I could call it anything I want, right? I could call it session, I don't know, umbrellas or bunny ears or whatever, right? But I'm going to say user ID because that's what I'm assigning as the identifier, user ID. Okay. So get login loads my login form. I'm going to submit my credentials, find my user using the login, which is in this case the email, authenticate that the password email combination is correct. If it is, this is what's actually logging in. Actually logging the user in. Okay. I'm assigning a key value pair to the session hash. And from there, the user is now logged in, and I want to go show, show the user's page, which I don't really have yet, right? I haven't created a user show page yet. So I'll say redirect to users. And then what if I already had my user's show page? What would that look like? In fact, we could build it right now. What would a user's show route look like in terms of the action here?
It would be get.
Okay.
Like dashboard or whatever you said before, maybe?
Well, let's just say let's choose that it's just the user's show page. I'll say the landing page is just going to be the user's show page. I said it the way before just to show you can choose as the developer where you want someone to go when they log in. We're going to go to the user's show page. That's what we're going to choose, just for simplicity's sake. So what does the show route look like? First of all, what is the URL? Get user / what? We need an identifier of some sort.
User ID?
Yeah, and this is where I mentioned dynamic URLs. If we see a symbol in the URL, then this piece of the URL will change, and that will become a key value pair in the params hash. Okay, so for now, I'm just going to say user. This will be the user show route. Okay, I'm just going to return this as a string for now because I haven't built a view for it yet. Okay, so I'm not going to put any logic in before I do that. For now, I'm just going to say go ahead and redirect to. What does this need to look like now? This redirect.
Users.
Yep.
Interpolate.
Yes, good.
User ID at user ID.
Yes, that's exactly right. I interpolate, and that way I pass in the actual user's ID, which will then in turn match this route down here. And let's just see if that worked finally. So I took out my bindings. by the way, let's just, for good measure, I'll go ahead and put the session. Okay. Actually, let's be specific. Yeah, let's do the whole session. Let's see if that works. And finally, we need to go log in. Okay. Sometime, maybe. There's my get login, my request. Here's my form. Whoops. I'm going to go ahead and click that login. I should be sending a post login request, which, by the way, we see down once it's actually loads and gets past the binding, we can see that request in the browser here. Now that I don't have a binding, we should see it rather quickly. So there's my post login. It worked. Okay, it didn't show me everything I wanted here. Here's the session, but it didn't give me all my key value pairs. I was wondering if it would or not. Anyway, so I finally got get users 1, and if I look back at the browser, I'm going to shrink this back down a little bit. There it is. This will be my user shell route, which means that we got exactly where we wanted to. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So right now I'm going to go back to my terminal, and I'm going to look at what I've done. Git status. Okay. I've changed my application controller, which was to enable sessions, so I'm going to add that. App controllers, application controller, git commit, enable sessions. Okay, then I'm going to add my users log controller, and this is kind of a big commit. This is maybe a little bigger than it should be. Let's see, what did we do? We added, we fill out our login, get login, get and post login. That's really what the gist of what we did. And then everything else was to add a login.erb. Okay. So really, I should have said built the form, but oh well. I should have been more specific. So it's just about noon. Let's talk about where we want to go from here. I didn't quite get as far as I wanted to, but we did make some really good headway here. I have a get login form, a login view now which contains the form. I've got a post login route which now allows a user to log in. And sort of there's a couple of outstanding questions like where do we go from here? What do I do with this now that a user's logged in? And throughout my code, I'm going to need like a way to reference, is a user logged in at any given moment in time? What am I going to build now that will allow me to do that? From anywhere in my views and anywhere in my controllers, I want to be able to have a quick and easy method to determine whether someone is logged in, and if they are, who that person is. Any thoughts? Like what am I talking about here?
Some helper methods
Absolutely. And where should they live?
in the application controller.
100%. Okay. So I'm going to open up a block here, helpers do, and I'm going to put some helper methods in here. Okay. What's a good helper method to determine if someone's logged in or not?
Logged in.
Oh, that's a good one. Okay, and I'm going to return a Boolean from this. And so in Ruby, the convention is if I'm going to return a Boolean from a method, I say Boolean, of course I mean true or false. Ruby doesn't have a Boolean class, but that's okay. It's true class or nil class. Sorry, true class or false class. I'm going to return true or false. And so I end the method in a question mark. I already know that there's at least one other method that I'm going to use here. Does anyone know what it is?
Current user.
Current user, and that's actually where I'm going to start. Current user should return the current user if there is one. So let's start here. How would I find the current user?
From the sessions hash.
Exactly. And what key value pair did I add to the session hash if someone is logged in?
The user ID.
Exactly. And here I can use the find method. The find method takes an integer and looks up the ID, that's why one of the reasons why I use it on the session. So now, User.find will return the user if there is one. Now, here's where I need to know something about active record methods. Does anyone know what find returns if it doesn't find what it's looking for? And we can look because I don't have tux. Okay, bundle exec tux. Let's just look at that quickly. Maybe. Okay, I can pass in an integer of 1. That returns a user. If I say user.find 37, I actually get an error, and that could be problematic. So even though I could use the find method, I don't want this thing to throw an error. I actually want it to return a particular value if a user's not found. Like, what would be useful if you think about it? What would be a good thing for current user to return if there's not a user that's logged in?
No.
Nil. So there are several ways I could do that. However, what I know is find by actually returns nil if I pass in a key value pair that doesn't match. And that's the behavior I want. So I'm actually going to switch over to find by. And I'm going to find by ID and session ID. So now this will return a user if it exists based on the session ID, or nil. Okay? Everybody okay with that?
Why doesn't the ID key match the session user ID?
Why don't these two things match?
Yeah.
So user.findBy is an active record method that's going to query the database. Does my user schema have anything called user underscore ID?
No.
No, but it does, and even though you don't see it here, it automatically is going to get assigned an ID, right? Whereas when I logged a user in, I decided to use the key called user underscore ID. I made this choice, right? I could have called this ID. I prefer user underscore ID. To me, if I say session ID, and this is my personal opinion. This is not fact, right? My opinion is if I see session ID, that should refer to the ID of the session. Even though we already saw earlier the ID of the session is contained, whoops, not here. The ID of the session is actually contained in a key called session underscore ID, but to me, it just feels better for user underscore ID. So that's simply a personal preference. You can use ID if you want, if that feels better to you, and say user.findBy ID session ID. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so you could do it either way. Either way is fine. But I prefer this way. I actually much prefer this because to me it's more specific. I'm not talking about the ID of the session, I'm talking about the ID of the user, and that's what I use to log a user in and out. So here, this is what Active Record is going to query the database with. This is simply the value that I'm passing as the value of a user's ID. Okay, and logged in should return true if user is logged in, otherwise false. Okay. So with helper methods, it's really nice sometimes to use helper methods that we already have. So does anyone know a shortcut or a nice way that I could return true or false, whether a user is logged in or out, and use my other helper method that I have right here? Any ideas? I could simply return current user. And it would either be nil or the user, and that would work. But I want to return true or false Boolean. Okay. The way I can use a double bang. Does everyone understand what a double bang does? I should say, does anyone not understand what the double bang does? Has anyone not seen that before? Everyone's comfortable that takes a value and basically turns it into a Boolean reflection of its truth, of an object's truthiness. So in Ruby, really, nil and false are falsy. And so they'll simply be converted to false. And everything else is truthy. All objects, integers, numbers, everything is truthy in Ruby pretty much, except for nil and false. And so even an empty string and an empty array are truthy in Ruby. And so this will return true if there is a user here. I'm going to go ahead and push this one step further. Does anybody know a way that I can eliminate a few database calls? Suppose I refer to current user like 27 times in a particular view. I know that's crazy, but what if I did? Is there a way that I could actually reduce the number of database calls here? Using a technique called memoization. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create an instance variable. An instance variable is going to live throughout a particular, an instance variable has life outside of its own method, right? It's scoped, the scope of an instance variable is to the instance. In this case, our class is application controller. A new instance of application controller, we're not going to get into the details, is created with these requests. And so if I refer to current user multiple times, I can save some database calls by saying current user or equals user.find by ID session ID. What that does is the first time current user is referenced within the scope of an instance of application controller, this instance variable will be created and assigned if, of course, the user is found. Otherwise, it'll still be nil. And that way, a subsequent call to current user, if it's already populated, won't hit the database again. It's just a little energy saver. That's all. Okay. And still, this doesn't change. So now I have two helper methods available throughout my views and my controllers to be able to tell me if someone's logged in or not. All right. So I'm going to add that as to my Git. That's because I'm not there. Okay. I'm going to add, oops. Oh my gosh. Any questions about anything we've talked about today? Any questions at all? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and stop my recording.